All right, Giancarlo, in the length of a tweet or a tweet thread, what did we talk about today?
We talked about podcast advertising, how you can measure it, how you can add it to your marketing mix. And, we had a good conversation about tools that can help you really succeed if you decide to go that route and advertise on podcasts.
Beautiful. This was great.
All right, everyone. Enjoy the episode. I'm Amy Syed.
I'm Sean Collins.
And this is Numbers and Narratives. Sean, I think the thing that we decided we want to chat about today was, I think getting advice from Giancarlo and getting just the lay of the land on podcast advertising. Because I don't know anything about it. It's kind of a fascinating world. It matters to me both as a business owner and as for us as a podcast. A podcast, yeah, not a podcast company, but just a podcast. So,
Volcano Listos, but yeah.
Yeah, Volcano Listos.
But yeah, I agree. I mean, dude, I had Giancarlo. First of all, I had such a great time hanging out with you last night.
It was a blast, guys. We had a really good time. It was good to get to know you. Thank you so much for sponsoring our content. It's always great for us to be able to meet with clients in person, to put a face to the name of the people who are sponsoring our content. And for me, I think it's the most validating part of the job, to be honest with you.
Sean, do you listen to Pod Save America? And I completely understand why you guys advertise on there, but I didn't realize he was with Crooked Media. I was telling him when I was a sophomore or a junior in college and they first kind of started, I think John Favreau and all the other guys started the sort of podcast. I was like, oh wow, this is like a sweet organization. I really want to work here. So I emailed them being like, please, for the love of God, can I have an internship? And it was just like, sure, but it's August. We're not really gonna look for summer interns until May
next year. Yeah,
next year is so maybe reach out then. But that's cool. Giancarlo, do you wanna? You haven't actually. I haven't let you speak at all. Do you wanna introduce yourself and kind of say what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm Giancarlo Bizzarro, Vice President of Sales at Crooked Media. I've been selling it for 7 years, been internally for 5. Prior to that, I was at a small little talent agency called WME, where I saw a lot of the deals kind of go down, specifically the minimum guarantee deals that a lot of the bigger networks were putting forth. But before that, I was selling what was Pod Save America at a company called Cadence 13. They were a small podcast startup. And then prior to that, I was at a podcast ad agency called Oxford Road, where I met a lot of the people who we were with last night, because they went on to start their own ad sort of consultancy for podcasting. They do more than just podcasting, but I work with a lot of advertisers in the space, love being on pods, think it is the most intimate form of media that you can be on, and happy to talk to you guys. Thanks for inviting me on today.
Yeah, pumped to have you. I think last night was a great reminder of how little I know relative to other people about podcast advertising. And that was, okay, this is a good one.
Let's say that you're the head of sales. You're trying to sell to me. I run a small company. What are the kind of things I have to think about to decide? I guess do I usually when I go to a agency that is gonna sell ads on my behalf to be on a podcast. I don't exactly know what the right terms here are, but how does that relationship work? Am I going to you? Do you find the right does the agency find the right podcast that has the right listener base to view my message? How does that work?
Yeah, so there's many ways to work with clients. We have a lot of clients that we work with through sort of consultancy and agency relationships. And we also have clients that work with us directly, and we're some of the only podcasts that they buy. One of the first things I ask a client before they come in and test podcasting as a form of their media channel is basically, what other channels are you advertising on and how's it going? And if they're like, we're spending money on digital and we've hit sort of diminishing returns on that, and we keep funneling money into sort of, Meta, what have you, and we're not seeing the results get better, I then suggest, hey, take that money that is not performing or you're just putting in there and move that into podcasts or other forms of offline media. The landscape has evolved. It's changed a lot since I started. When I started buying, there were not as many podcasts as there are today. Saturation is a big issue, but also is discoverability. So one of the benefits of working with an agency, or consultancy, they can come in and have learnings from other clients that what shows work, what shows don't, what price points make sense. And they can sort of caveat that. If you were to come to me directly at Crooked, first I'd ask you those questions just to determine whether or not you're ready to be on podcasting. And if you're not, I would honestly say, hey, you should go test your other digital channels. How's your marketing funnel working? Are you capable of sort of converting clients? Do you have things set up in a way that if you do start on podcast advertising or offline advertising, that somebody can come into that funnel and convert? Those are all really key things to set up before you want to kind of advertise in podcasting. And, if all those things are checked off, then I'll provide you shows that I think make sense for you. I'm not going to try to upsell you stuff or package stuff together, which you may get if you're going as a direct advertiser to a lot of salespeople, because they're just trying to offload as much open inventory as possible. I think it depends on how you want to advertise as well. If you're looking for conversion or D2C sorts of conversions, you shouldn't be on every single episode. You need a little bit of breathing room so that your return on ad spend can sort of take off over time and you're not just pumping money into something and not seeing the results. So I recommend buying actually at a frequency of maybe once or twice a month at max. But there's many ways to sell. And if at any point you want to monetize this podcast, there's also ways to get revenue for it that are outside traditional advertising models. But I'll shut up now because I've talked for 4 minutes.
No. That's totally fine. Most people monologue on this podcast, so you're good.
That when you say once to twice a month, you're talking about per show, yeah?
Yeah. And again, right, that's the model that traditionally works for D2C. So when I was at the ad agency, I helped launch or plan campaigns for a lot of D2C type of advertisers, companies that were B2B, B2C, SaaS products, sort of CPG packaged goods, technological products. And I think each one has a different sort of KPI, right? And the different CAC that they're trying to hit. But yeah, 1 to 2 is generally a good amount if you're buying it episodically. That was the only way you could buy previously. You'd get, a campaign started, the show was kind of edited into the content. And one of the great things about buying podcasts that way is if you were buying stuff that was evergreen and your ad was living there forever, you would be getting residual conversions until people stopped listening to that show. What's changed a little bit in the last few years is that companies will strip those ads out, or they'll serve it dynamically. They'll sell against an impression set as opposed to an episode. I don't think that's the best way for D2C buyers to purchase, but some networks only sell that way because they're trying to get revenue from other platforms, whether it be like a DSP that's serving programmatically, or, they're selling multiple campaigns. And once you hit your impression, they'll put somebody else in, especially in evergreen content. For news, politics, more current events based shows, I don't think that's the best way of buying. I would recommend buying, a host read, ideally, starting an ad break and trying to kind of see what they can offer, because most of the consumption of those shows is going to happen within the first 24 to 72 hours. Sometimes people will go back and listen up to 30 days, but for the most part, it's easier for us as a company to kind of have those ads stick in there. It's better for the advertiser. It converts better. And so that's kind of the model that we do at Crooked. With that being said, you can get conversion from other types of media sources, even if you're buying impression based. It's just dependent on how it's priced, where your ad lives within the episode, and how you're measuring that conversion.
There were a lot of things in there that I think we should break down very, very one by one. So let's start. You talked about host read was a phrase you said. That one feels obvious, where I assume it means the host is reading. If we're not doing host read, what are the other options for alternatives to that?
So you can pre-produce an ad, right? Stuff that you hear on the radio. Most places will, larger networks that are selling more run of network across their entire catalog campaigns will record one ad. There's a lot of AI solutions. I know you do that. So, you can basically get an ad recorded and run that programmatically across different shows all at the same time. You can target. I think that given the intimate nature of a podcast, when you're listening to it and you're hearing someone, there's this theater of the mind effect, especially when you're really deep into an episode, that resonates with the listener. So if you have that same person doing an ad read, they're generally going to tend to be more attentive during that period of time, as opposed to if you're pre-producing an ad and it comes in, it's kind of like, the radio, right? Like you're listening to the radio, an ad comes on, you might switch the channel. So you can skip ads in podcasts. And I think the propensity of people skipping are different when the host is reading.
I was going to say that's exactly right. I think that for the podcast that I listen to, Spotify will have it's like sometimes I actually don't know how this works, because I don't know. I always like get more angry when it plays like the Spotify ad, because I'm like, no, go forward. I pay for Spotify Premium. I don't want to listen to this. But then when the host reads it, it's like, oh yeah, this is fine. Like I almost never forward. I think the probability that I forward is a lot higher when it's not host read.
This is dumb because I'm spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on podcast ads, and this is just now occurring to me. But in my head, when the host reads it, I'm paying the host and I'm supporting the show. And when the platform serves it, I'm serving like the app that I'm listening to. And I just realized how stupid that is. But literally in my head until now, I've been like, oh yeah, when the host reads, I'm paying the show, and otherwise I'm paying Spotify.
Yeah, I think that it depends on how those relationships are, right? Like obviously when it's not a host read, some partnerships are on a rev share agreement. I can talk about the talent side if you want me to. I don't really want to get too much into the details of that because I can't speak to our relationship financially. But what I can say is that, yeah, a lot of the times when you're paying the host to read an ad, the show's benefiting. Most of the time when you're buying across a platform, the show hypothetically will, I'd say, get a portion of that, but that might not be running against every single download or listen on that show. So it might just be targeting people that you're looking to hit. It might be running across a bunch of different shows. So that show might get, 100 impressions of a $100,000 campaign. So obviously it benefits the show if you're buying it directly. So that's a really good point, Sean.
So that was actually a great next one. So we talked about host read versus, pre-record. We talked about it being like actual live read versus dynamic. And then you just said something about targeting. So like, other than picking a show, how are you targeting podcast ads?
Well, do you want me to sell it to you, or do you want me to give you the true answer? I think that
sell it to us.
Okay. Well, listen, like what you're doing is you're targeting age range, demo, geolocation. So if you're a company that can only operate within a certain state, generally what networks will do is they'll say, hey, we'll target people who live in New York and Los Angeles and just those DMAs. It gets more expensive to do that. It's not as easy to set up because a lot of the time, people may download a show in New York and then travel to another place. They may not be from New York. So you're still getting your ad targeted to that person who just happens to be in transit through New York, and they're going to listen to it when they get home to Missouri or wherever they live. You can also, it's using Nielsen Exalate data a little bit. Sometimes it's using IP matching. Scientifically, it's accurate-ish, but it's not as accurate as digital. And I'm just being fully transparent on that. That's probably not a good way to sell it, but I'd rather be honest than.
That was going to be my question, which is like, how can you tell? Because we don't get very many. It's like we do this through Buzzsprout. We put it on YouTube. YouTube does a little bit. Like whenever we have an episode that has enough listens, it'll kind of tell us a little bit about it. But like Spotify doesn't seem to tell us anything. Apple Pod doesn't seem to tell us anything. Buzzsprout does not have any dashboards outside of like listens for this podcast specifically.
So I think different hosting platforms have better levels of sophistication, right? And obviously we actually use like Magellan and Podscribe and other sort of forms of, it's basically podcast ad tech. And what we can kind of drill down to is where people are listening to our shows, how many unique devices they're listening on, specifically where they are in location. And some of these services can even get as granular as like education level, household income. So I think it depends on what you're paying for at a large network, or if you're at sort of a behemoth like Spotify or SXM or iHeart. they've bought all of this technology to basically hone in on that. As an independent podcaster, you know, Buzzsprout is great. You're getting your show out there, but sometimes it might not have the technicality that you're looking for if you're trying to monetize it. So that's something that, you know, just you get what you pay for kind of situation.
Considering I don't pay for, I don't know. I think we pay a little bit for Buzzsprout, but it's like it's not very much.
We talked about who reads it. We talked about targeting and it being like native or programmatic. The other thing you'd said was kind of ad breaks and where in a podcast should ads fall? Is that something that an advertiser can decide or negotiate or fight for, or kind of how does the placement of an ad work?
Listen, so you can buy, there's pretty much 3 ads: a pre-roll, a mid-roll, and a post-roll. Each have their purpose, right? So for a pre-roll, you're the first thing coming in the show. Obviously, a lot of people listen to the first part of the show. So if you're the first advertiser in the show, people will hear it. Generally, what we try to do on our content is not make that ad the very first thing. Sometimes it is, just depends on how things are. If you're serving things programmatically, some of the DSPs like you to mark up that first place. I think what's the best method for an advertiser, if you're going to buy that position, is to try to find shows that will do like a little intro, 2-3 minutes, and then have sort of that 60-second pre-roll, just because people are starting to tune in. Like if it's the very first thing they hear, they might not pay attention or be sort of in that same sort of setting that it's going to resonate with them as, say, a mid-roll perhaps, because when somebody's really deep into content, generally you are paying more attention to what's being said. And when an ad comes in, it converts a little bit better for D2C. But I think that if I'm a tune-in platform or like streaming or film release, that pre-roll is actually really important. It's like, go see my movie in theaters in 2 weeks, right? And they buy a lot of that stuff. The post-roll actually is really good for cross-promotion. And what you'll see is other podcasts buying or taking up that space, because essentially they want you after you're done listening. And somebody who's listened to the entire episode and finishes it may not be done wanting to consume content. So if I'm promoting, say, this podcast or another podcast, generally where I want to put that is the post roll, because it's probably the most economical buy that you can make amongst those 3 ad units. And it's going to have the most loyal people who finish the show at the end and maybe looking to listen to something else.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it's like at the end of a Netflix show, and it's like, all right, now check.
Exactly. It'll like auto pop what you should be watching afterwards.
This is maybe a silly question, but let's say that I wanted to be, we can pick like I actually don't, by design, the only podcasts that I can think of are big podcasts, like acquired, right? Like how big should my like podcast ad budget be? Like if I'm going to try to like run an experiment or two, let's say that I'm like relatively successful on, digital. I like kind of know who I'm trying to talk to. I know who listens to a specific type of podcast. I know who I'm trying to go after. I want to go after some of these big guys, like, how much should I try to like budget for this kind of thing? I know that's kind of a dumb question.
No, it's a great question. It's one I answer all the time. I think that it depends on, like, personally, your budget depends on how much disposable marketing budget you have. And then I'd say for performance, you generally want to run 2 or 3 episodes, because if somebody is introduced to a product for the first time, it might not always convert. But by that 2nd and 3rd episode, you should be seeing sort of things go up as people are more familiar with what you're presenting to them. So I think 2, 3, 4, if you can, like a quarter campaign, 3 or 4 episodes generally tends to work well. Every 3 weeks is good. And based on your budget, you can find shows that maybe aren't as big as some of the stuff that we sell, where you can still get results in. And that's where maybe working with somebody who's been doing this for a long time kind of guide you, hey, these are like some good shows. They're within your budget. They're not going to break the bank. And once we have a pulse in this media channel, if it's working, hopefully that opens up more budget once we're hitting whatever KPIs you have as a company.
Got it.
For our stuff, I recommend like 25 to 50, sometimes $75,000 over the course of a quarter. Some of the campaigns I've launched that were at that price point then would scale to the kind of budgets that Sean is spending in podcasts right now. But obviously they didn't start out that way, right? And even the big players like ZipRecruiter is a company that has been with Crooked Media since the beginning.
I was gonna say ZipRecruiter is the only reason I know who ZipRecruiter is because of podcasts.
But that's the thing, right? Like I was at the agency that launched them. Their very first campaign was kind of around the budgets I said, and it was spread out across a myriad of content, not just, one or two things. And they were hesitant at first, right? And so I think that both from a sales perspective, like you have to never discount the type of product that's coming into your show. From a host perspective, you have to take things seriously. I always try to encourage our hosts to research, to look at stuff, to be familiarized. And if they like a product, I will absolutely tell that product that, or the agency that's representing them. I'll try to get product in their hands. I'll try to do an onboarding call with either, the agency or the actual advertiser, like the client, the brand itself. Because if you put a human element into these campaigns, then you can hear it in the way that a host read is being delivered, as opposed to if there's something that they may not use or may not consume or have no in any way familiarity with. You'll hear that in the read, and it becomes maybe not as effective. And maybe that brand will have a bad experience and will say, yeah, podcasting isn't for me. And as salespeople and stewards of people's marketing budgets, like that's not what we want to do. We want people to have the best experience possible. And if it doesn't work, we want to come out and say why it didn't and why they should still continue being in the channel, even if it's not with content that we represent.
First of all, the ZipRecruiter team, like we need to get them that clip of Ivy saying the only reason I even know this brand is because of podcasts. Like that alone says that you remembered them. Like you weren't actively listening to podcasts about ZipRecruiter and it literally came to mind. I can corroborate the 50K-ish range. That's where we started our test, exactly the way you described. 50K across 2 to 3 months, across a bunch of verticals, about two episodes per show to kind of give them a real chance. And it was pretty obvious, pretty quick how impactful podcasts were going to be for us. And like, I actually, I can't say the number now, but we are spending a lot of money in this because it is an effective channel. It's awesome. It's a great way to reach new audiences.
Not every show is going to work. And that's what we know at the gate, right? But the 7 out of the 10 podcasts that you may be testing at the beginning, you double down on those. And the other 3, you say, thanks, like really appreciate having worked with you. It's just not the right fit for the type of product we have. And then you hopefully with those 7 shows that have worked, you've locked in the long-term relationship. You're getting that conversion still. You let that thing run its course. Hopefully it lasts a long time. Sometimes it doesn't, right? But you've built your sort of stable roster of content that you're sponsoring. And ideally, if you're a D2C marketer, you're using the conversions that you get to sort of expand that budget. And generally that's how it works, right? If things are working, people put more money into it because it takes money to make money.
Oh yeah, big time. This actually brings me to maybe a last question, just because we want to be respectful of time. How do you guys track conversion rates, and like how do they compare to sort of like more traditional like digital media outlets? Like I assume that because you can be really, really focused, and the types of people, like I don't know, like StatSig is another company. Like the only reason I know what StatSig is because of their acquired episodes. I don't really use StatSig. We're not really a competitor to them, but like, I don't know, like they advertise on Acquired quite a lot. And that's a podcast that I really like. Like I have never seen an ad for them in any other place, but I am sort of like the type of person that would use it. If I get sort of like the product market fit messaging of it, right? I assume that it's really converts pretty well, but I don't know what those actually look like. Is there anything you can talk to on that front? Maybe that's a complicated question.
No, I can speak to it. Like, a lot of brands that don't have big budgets, they'll try to find content that maybe isn't as large, that is exactly what they do, and that's speaking to a specific subsegment of people that they really want to reach. I spoke with somebody yesterday, and he lives in Barcelona, and his whole podcast is probably in the, I don't want to give numbers out, but it's not that big, right? But what he'll do is he'll bring people on, interview them. And because he's sort of in a VC type of setting, they pay him a significant amount for a single episode. And generally they're reaching only the people they want to hear. I mean, it's something that, I worked with Ring, the video doorbell. And one of the things they just gotten rejected from Shark Tank we did is we put them on all the tech podcasts. And it wasn't, the biggest buy, but what it did is it got all the early adopters who, are really interested in tech to buy this product, and it positioned them in a way that they could then expand outwards and become more sort of mass appeal. But I think that if you focus on a content fit when it comes to conversion, you're tracking these channels. There's so many more ways to track than there was in the past. In the past, you had a promo code or a landing page. You could see a very small percentage of the people who would go through and use it, but that wasn't telling you the entire story of who was coming through your, sort of sales funnel. Now you can pixel ads, whether, all of our shows have a pixel on an RSS feed that can cross-reference an IP address. So if somebody hears an ad and maybe it doesn't go through your funnel, and makes a conversion, it will go through and essentially match that person to having listened to an ad. And if you're running a lot of shows, it can match multiple shows so that, it gives credit out equally. That didn't really exist up until a few years ago. I think that's a really good fit. Obviously that costs money. It takes resources. So if you're a really small company, sometimes it's just, you want to dip your feet into this space, finding a show that specifically is reaching people that may use the product. It's a good way of looking at it. I think the more you get sophisticated, the more you can kind of look in and see, this is how things are converting. This is how we really want to scale. So yeah, there's many ways to go about doing this. It's not a one size fits all model. And I think that, it's just up to how you want to test and what your budgets are.
You were on a panel actually yesterday, or hosted a panel yesterday at Adweek about, and one of the topics was like exactly this, right? It was how do you measure? And if we're thinking, for e-com brands in particular, you need to get the app fairing. And that's sort of just like, this isn't a question. Pause this episode, go download the fucking app, and then come back and resume. Like, you need to be using fairing. And that is going to be another phenomenon. Like, so yeah, you can still use promo codes. You can still do landing pages. You're getting the last touch thing. You should be using fairing to hear how people hear about you and how they remember you. And that product's come a really long way. And then there's, a couple other pixel options, right? You can do, I'm bad on names. So
sure, there's Podscribe, there's Magellan, there's Spotify ad attribution, which used to be Podsights and Chartable. They acquired both of these companies. There's Claritas. There's a myriad of things that you can use. Some of them have their strengths and weaknesses. I think that, to Sean's point, like a post-purchase survey using something like fairing really does help, because people will convert, and then you can send them a follow-up. You can give them options. You can put a buffer in there. Maybe you don't advertise on newspapers, but you put it in. You can kind of use that data to then model like potentially like who may be coming through and converting, who's still not coming through the funnel that you want, or isn't being picked up by the pixel-based attribution that you have on your campaign. That's a way to get a much more holistic view into what you're looking into. When I started buying podcast ads, this was almost 10 years ago at this point, you maybe saw 15, 20%. We still use the post-purchase survey, but like a lot of companies just, they're like, oh, we have to do this. Like, why is this important? And I was like, well, because if you're only seeing 15%, 50 to 20% of the people that are converting, you're not getting an entire picture, and you're just going to write off a channel before it even actually has a chance to succeed. So that was before pixels. The only way to measure was funnel and surveys. But now you have this sort of suite of ways to see what's happening. And, we use it internally. We've got a big e-commerce site on Crooked. When we run our sort of cross promotion ads for merch, we have t-shirts, we've got like fanny packs. I mean, I coffee cups, what have you. We'll run that stuff ourselves to see, hey, like what product is converting? How is it converting? Like, did the sale that we maybe ran for, the summer, did that have an impact? And we as a company use that. I mean, not a lot of places have the luxury of doing that, but I think it's important for us because not only are we a podcast company, but we also have, this merch side. We have more of an impact arm that gets people to register to vote or take action. And we're trying to be as tactical as we can with the resources that we have so that we can be as effective as possible in our messaging and how we sort of convey stuff. And it's hard, but it works.
I love it. Okay.
That's awesome.
Should we talk about who didn't sponsor this show and then call it a day?
This episode is not sponsored by. Who do we pick?
Giancarlo, anyone you want to shout out that this show is not sponsored by?
Man, I can't throw clients under the bus like that or networks.
This episode is not sponsored by Crooked
Media. It's not sponsored by ExxonMobil or something.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure isn't. We've gotten zero big oil dollars have been invested into this show. This episode's not sponsored by Fairing, but I do want you to go get Fairing and then put this specific podcast in. I want to get a Slack from Matt Barr, the founder, that says, holy shit, I just got like 10 people to get my app. So go do that.
And buy Crooked if you're at a scalable point in your market media mix. Please.
Yes.
I'd be happy to sell to you and try to make things work.
Honestly, I want to do this now. Cool. Thanks, Giancarlo. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it.